Grappling in weapon martial arts. Should it be taught in every single weapon martial arts school? Well, the answer could be at the bottom of this bottle. Instead, let's do some digging.
G'day mates, Nate the Aussie here. How you all doing? This is not a classic response, but rather a continuation of the conversation on grappling in sword combat, as posited by the YouTube channels English Martial Arts, Scholar Gladiatoria, and the Scholar General, 墨讲点兵. This is a debate that has a broad spectrum, where there are channels like Aisu Ikosai on Hard to Hurt, stating that HEMA is completely unnecessary to learn how to defend yourself with a weapon, and most of its practitioners will get smoked by any armed wrestler from MMA, all the way through to certain clubs who almost steadfastly refuse to teach any grappling along with the techniques they interpret. As someone who trains in IKMF self-defense, MMA on the side with mates, in HEMA and HJMA, which is the historical Japanese variant of HEMA, I won't spend too much time on Icy Mike's video, as Matt Easton's response to him was very well made and hits the nail on the head. I'll put the link to that video in the description. But what about grappling in historical swordsmanship? How much is it a thing, and why? As perspectives from historical European and Chinese martial arts have been brought forward, I will be approaching this from my own experience and background from a historical Japanese perspective, specifically within the lens of historical text from the Momoyama period to the early Edo period. Specifically, this is a timestamp extending from approximately 1545 to 1645. Before I get into the historical Japanese perspective expressed in the martial arts text, however, I'll begin by establishing the basis of historical people coming into fencing compared to those in modern day, and when grappling happens in combat through the lens of range. Firstly, and this is a point on which I agree with the English Martial Arts channel, one big difference between the average person in many historical periods and today is that the former historical person was a lot more accustomed to wrestling. In fact, due to the practice inherently not needing any special equipment other than the human body, various places around the world had wrestling and unarmed striking as a pastime, Japan included. The majority of people in the past, even just 60 years ago, were generally fitter than the majority of the population in the Western world today, let alone the population of 500 to 1,000 years ago or more. This means that the basis from which a historical person beginning fencing is quite different from the average person today. This is why I agree with the English Martial Arts channel insofar that if we want to approach a fencing system in a holistic way while keeping historical context in mind, learning how to wrestle and even unarmed striking can be particularly useful for a variety of reasons. However, wrestling, like all forms of combat, rely on a variety of things. One of the biggest of these things, in my opinion, is range. In melee combat, a term that I am defining purely for convenience's sake here as a melee bout of some kind between any number of individuals with a minimum of 2, there are 3 ranges: long, medium, and short. I will divide this into 2 categories, armed and unarmed, and will simplify the ranges based on the forms of combative techniques that are primarily done at these ranges. While there is slight variation depending on application of technique, these will be focusing on the basic separations of techniques in each range. While there is a slight variation depending on application of technique, these will be focusing on the basic separations of techniques in each range. For unarmed, long range is predominantly kicks, or, if you wish to include it, throwing objects. Medium range involves your jabs and crosses with closed fist and palm, and also the throwing of objects. Short range is usually your hooks, uppercuts, closed fist or with the heel of the palm, elbows, and grappling. Hammer fists can also fit into the medium and close ranges. Now onto armed combat, and of course armed weapons can vary in this depending on their length. Therefore, for simplicity and to keep in relevance with the initial conversation, I will mostly address swords shorter than a classic greatsword in matched combat with another weapon of the same type. Long range is primarily cuts delivered with the arms fully extended and as long a range as they comfortably allow. Thrusts also work very comfortably at this range. Medium range is more of a balance between arms and hip movement, with the elbows a little more bent than the long range cut, with thrusts still working comfortably. Short range involves cuts with a significant amount of hip rotation due to the lack of ability in using the arms to draw. Thrusts can be awkward depending on the blade length, pommel or crossguard strikes happen, and grappling often begins to happen here. This may also vary depending on the weapon, as a small sword will make closed grappling more difficult than if both combatants were using long swords, for example. What I am identifying here is that whether in unarmed or armed combat as stipulated above, grappling is a key element, and this cannot be ignored. However, as previously identified, it heavily depends on range. While a double leg takedown can be entered into from medium and maybe even long range very quickly, particularly if it is set up effectively, it still requires short range in order to make contact and finish or complete the technique. Until the technique is finished, it has not succeeded. This is a crucial observation to make. One can attempt to enter into grappling all they want, but unless they pull this off effectively, then the grappling technique has failed in the exchange. Keep all of this in mind as we now continue to the next topic, specifically the historical Japanese treatises and martial texts from 1540 to 1645. The timestamp leaves us with the following readily available texts: the various sword and military scrolls, including the Heiho Okugisho from Yamamoto Kansuke, which extends from the 1540s to around 1561, the Enpi Mokuroku text from Aisu Ikosai in 1576, the Heiho Kadensho from Yagyu Munenori in 1606, and the various scrolls from Miyamoto Musashi between 1604 to 1645. All of these texts are translated by a combination of well-known and qualified translators of classical texts, including Thomas Cleary, Alexander Bennett, William Scott Wilson, Hiroaki Sato, and Eric Shahan. There are, unfortunately, some texts I do not have in my possession that I will not be able to cover yet still do fit in our chosen timestamp, such as the Heiho Yukan by Hojo Ujinaga from the early 1600s. In the Heiho Okugisho, written by Yamamoto Kansuke in the year 1561, the first two segments of this text are all heavily grapple-focused. However, these are all specifically grappling situations, assuming short range, so this is unsurprising. As we move through all the other kamae, or guards or stances, there remains no advice for grappling at all. The only mention of grappling is on the very last stance, which shows two individuals at, once again, very close range, and mentions grabbing the opponent's weapon arm with your offhand to gain the advantage with your own weapon hand. While this could be concluded that Kansuke assumed that grappling options in each of these encounters was obvious, and so didn't include them, the lack of mention of grappling in the majority of the sword techniques is something clearly evident, and needs to be kept in mind. However, and this is a big however, when describing how best to approach learning how to fight in combat, the first skill Kansuke mentions is actually unarmed arts, striking and grappling. From his opinion, as well as other historical martial artists from around the world at this time and before and after, wrestling and unarmed striking developed one's coordination, knowledge of the strengths and vulnerabilities of the human body, yours and theirs, one's footwork and weight placement, and also provided a solid basis of coordination and skill upon which to build the skills of weapon combat. In regards to the writings of Aisu Ikosai within Kage-ryu, these are of interest to us due to these techniques in some form being passed on to Yagyu Munenori, who then compiled the Yagyu Shinkage-ryu system. Most of the texts I have seen from Ikosai are, unfortunately, within the genre of a mokuroku. Specifically, this makes the majority of the document little more than some illustrations with some vague terms and the occasional dot point notes as a reminder, clearly to someone who knew what they meant. The reason why I'm including this, however, is because when we utilize this in combination with the Dandao Faxue, a Chinese text by Cheng Zongyou, we get a possible reference to using the offhand to grapple. Cheng Zongyou claims he learned from someone who in turn learned from the Japanese on how to use a large sword, which we would nowadays refer to as a nodachi or odachi. Now, this may seem a little bit like a matter of he said, they said, but it's still something worth keeping in mind when we're discussing grappling in sword martial arts. Cheng Zongyou claims in his text that he is utilizing Japanese techniques, but there is one where he emphasizes this specifically as very much a Japanese technique. Here, you hold your weapon arm behind you with your offhand in front in some form, baiting the opponent in. You then use this hand to deflect or parry the opponent's blow. In Zongyou's context, this would be a spear, before you then close with them. Throughout the Kage-ryu scroll from Ikosai, you see stances that very much mimic this same concept. Is there a connection? It is impossible to prove for sure, though the idea is particularly intriguing to consider and would not be unreasonable to conclude. Nevertheless, the potential for grappling with the offhand here is very clearly evident. The Heiho Kadensho from 1606, compiled by Yagyu Munenori, who in turn had received texts in technique and philosophy from Kagyu, as mentioned earlier, mentions a significant amount of mindset, philosophy, methodology, before going into any specific technique per se. This is where we get the very curious idea of no sword. While in neither his techniques later on, nor the earlier text does he describe grappling in a literal sense per se, he does describe the art of no sword. While this description does not refer to any literal grappling techniques in a literal sense, it definitely hints at the concept of there being room for grappling as the situation allows. He explains it in two parts, which I have divided purely to describe two different themes within the same teaching. Firstly, open quotes. If your opponent does not want his sword taken, you should not insist on trying to take it. No sword is also in not taking the sword when your opponent has this attitude. A man who is consumed by the thought of not having his sword taken is going to forget the aim of cutting his opponent. When he thinks only of not having his sword taken, he will probably not cut you. Close quotes. Secondly, and here's the second mention, open quotes. What is called no sword is not the art of taking a man's sword. It is being able to use all implements freely. When you have a sword and wish to take your opponent's to use as your own, anything that comes into your hands should be of use. Even if you have only a fan, you should be able to defeat your opponent's sword. No sword is just this attitude. Therefore, according to Munenori in this section, things that may include grappling should not be pursued against an opponent who is desperately not trying to grapple. But then again, such an opponent is unlikely to cut you, or attack you in this case, if they're on the defensive especially. Rather, no sword is being able to use any implement freely, which, if one is thinking logically, would include your body in grappling and not having to purely rely on a sword, hence, no sword. Miyamoto Musashi refers to grappling throughout his texts. Some of these references are inferential and could be argued either way, so it is important to keep that in mind. These mentions allow room for grappling, but do not specifically mention it outright. For example, in the Sui no Maki, which is the water scroll, in point 11 he describes an approach exclusively using the blade, and then follows with, open quotes, if your enemy attacks again, parry in line with the sword's path to come in first. This coming first leaves room for grappling, though it is an inference based on what is hinted at, as opposed to the literal language of grappling per se. Various parts of Musashi's works include references like this that could be perceived as grappling opportunities, though the word could needs to be kept in mind here. In the Sui no Maki we have our first clear mention of making body contact, though it seems to describe more of a shoulder charge. However, he describes the situation almost as if this is something that can and maybe even should come about during a fight. Open quotes. The instant you penetrate your opponent's space, smash into him with your whole body. Crash your left shoulder in the enemy's chest, turning your head slightly as you do so. Synchronizing your breathing, smash into him vehemently with the aim of rebounding off the impact. Close quotes. Curiously, and immediately after it, we have the mention of a hand strike in weapon combat as part of a parry, open quotes. As the enemy attacks, drive at his face with your left fist as you quickly close in. With this third parry, think of it as delivering a left-handed punch. Well, if that's not talking about unarmed striking, then I don't know what is. In the Kanomaki, the fire scroll, we have mention of trampling the opponent's weapon, which Musashi claims can be done with the feet, reference to the Fiore fans watching this video, sword, spirit, and the body. He states that the goal here is not to collide with the enemy, but to, open quotes, finish him after the encounter, close quotes, with an emphasis on not allowing him to attack again. Once again, this is inferred grappling, but there is clear body contact being mentioned here, and that needs to be kept in mind. We then hear that the knocking out of the opponent's spirit can be done with the blade, mind, and body. Once we get to the Heido Kyo, that Musashi wrote in 1605, we get a few more references to grappling contact. After describing the different points of the blade, past being closer to the tip, the present being the percussion point of the blade, sort of closer to the center, and the future around the strong of the blade. He states that if you strike from any closer than the present, open quotes, you should grab hold of him. Continuing on, it is vital to cover the distance with your whole body. Close quotes. Mentioning how to capture someone alive while possibly working together with someone who has a yari, or if you don't know what that means, a spear, towards the end of the technique, he states, open quotes, thrust at the enemy's chest as you pull his short sword out. Then drop the swords while grabbing the enemy's right hand with your left before he can do anything. Quickly taking hold of his wrist, insert your longsword under his right side, pressing down on his chest and arm to knock him flat while stepping on his wrist and the hilt of his sword. As described before our brief analysis of some of the historical treatises, grappling is an effective tool to utilize at a close range. While it may be set up or initiated at various ranges, it is the closing in that allows the grappling technique to happen and to possibly be successful. When looking at the historical texts, we see grappling as something that is both, one, likely hinted at and given room to happen in a variety of techniques. Specifically, the techniques and grappling are not necessarily mutually exclusive. 2, a great starting point from which weapon techniques can be built. 3, a useful tool to use in close range to control the opponent and prevent them from further striking you, or the required approach to use when an opponent has initiated a close range encounter. And lastly, 4, something you should always keep in mind, whether it is something you or your opponent has at their disposal. Therefore, are weapon arts considered two-dimensional, or, I suppose, only half-baked if they are focusing purely on weapon striking and not grappling? Based on my own experience and the opinions cited through the literal written text we are left between 1540 and 1645 from Japan, I would argue that while the answer is nuanced depending on the specific weapon in question, grappling is a great basis from which to start and a tool that has its own range to be effective, like any other form of strike, and therefore has a crucial use in dynamic and practical weapon martial arts. Without grappling, you are leaving a piece or pieces of the puzzle missing, if you will. However, then again, we need to treat grappling like any other form of technique. Like all techniques, there are times for its use, and then there are times for other techniques to take precedence. Wrestling is therefore an effective approach, not a trump card that wins every exchange. Alright mates, I hope you found that analysis interesting or intriguing, and especially I hope that it encourages you to look into this stuff a little bit more. Shout out to English Martial Arts, Matt Easton, and also my mate at Scholar General, Mo Jianbian. I really appreciate the work that you guys do in putting this information out there, and I hope that this video continues the conversation even further. But until next time, I'll see all you mates in the next video. Bye-bye.